All right, everybody. So this week we're looking at three authors, Kipling, Stevenson, and Wilde. This video is going to be a little bit about Kipling and Stevenson. We would have looked at both of them um, in a regular class. Now, we've talked a little bit about short fiction before. The Sherlock Holmes stories were short fiction. We talked about serialized fiction. But the two writers who really made the short story in the English language a thing, it had been a thing in French for a while, but were Kipling and Stevenson. And you read two short stories by each of the authors. Jekyll and Hyde is a longer short story, but a short story. So let's start with Kipling. Born in India, lived there until he was 5 years old, and then his family sent him home to Britain, and I'm putting home in scare quotes because he never felt at home in Britain. Later, when he would move to Sussex with his American wife, he would say, "I'm slowly discovering England, which is the most wonderful foreign land I have ever been in." So this sense of alienation, of never quite fitting in, belonging, connecting, and yet being able to see things in such depth from an outsider's point of view is a hallmark of Kipling's writing. And he was very popular as well as very prolific. He did a lot of writing. Another thing that you should know about him is he is the first person to receive a Nobel Prize in literature who was English. Ironic, because sometimes he didn't really identify very much with being English. He's as well known, or was as well known during his life for his political views as for his writing. He opposed Indian independence, interestingly enough. And yet he saw all of the, well, not all of the, but he really captured the brutality and the inhumanity of British imperialism, particularly in India. And although he's sometimes pointed to as the imperial colonialist, and if you read poems that are in our book like The White Man's Burden, they can make you cringe. And yet some people argue that The White Man's Burden should be read ironically, or at least somewhat ironically. His books of stories about India, including The Jungle Book, continue to capture readers' interest and attention many, many years later. And the short story that we read was Without Benefit of Clergy, which you may get a chance to write about this week. Moving on, Robert Louis Stevenson, the adventure writer. He was known as a boys' writer because, of course, he wrote Treasure Island and he wrote Kidnapped, wonderful adventure stories about young men. But what he really was interested in is in the duality of human nature. He had a very strict Calvinist Scottish upbringing. From the time he was very, very small, he was interested in ideas of good and evil, in the idea that these existed in the same person. And so many people see the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as sort of a culmination of all the things that he was working on. And it may be tempting to say, well, I don't really understand the difference. I really don't see the similarity, rather, between a book like Treasure Island and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But you have to remember that Jim Hawkins, the boy who is the main character, really, you could argue Long John Silver, is beginning to realize that adventure, excitement, these things that are good are also combined with things that are bad, greed, the pursuit of personal ambition at the expense of others. So the inspiration for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde came to Stevenson actually in a dream. I had long been trying to write a story on this subject, said Stevenson, to find a body, a vehicle for that strong sense of man's double being. Victorian audiences really responded to the story. It became very, very popular. we talked a little bit about morality. And what I think Stevenson and the Victorians and people today respond to is that for Stevenson, our book puts this really well, morality and propriety are the true evils. What endangers Dr. Jekyll is the restrictive social code that he lives by. And Stevenson had experience with this. He grew up in a very strict sort of regimented household. And then he fell in love with an American who was 10 years older. She was already married. She already had a child. As soon as she was divorced, he married her. This caused a lot of consternation, shall we say, among his family. But he understood what it was to feel confined by society's definitions. And I think that Dr. Jekyll is his expression of that. The universal appeal of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde seems based on a striking literary effect. Most readers, Victorian as well as modern, identify with the villain of the piece. The critic J.A. Symonds protested to Stevenson, "It touches one too closely. Most of us, at some epoch of our lives, have been upon the verge of developing a Mr. Hyde." The poet and priest Gerard Manley Hopkins confessed to his friend Robert Bridges, who had questioned the realism of the story, "You were certainly wrong about Hyde being overdrawn. My Hyde is worse." And I think one of the terrifying things about this savage alter ego, Mr. Hyde, is in the story, we never quite figure out what it is that he gets up to. We know it's bad, but we don't know how bad. And I think that poses a really interesting question about when we go to those places as humans. Are we even fully aware? Are we even fully in control of not only what we're doing, but of the ramifications of what we're doing, remembering what we're doing? Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful work of literature, and I hope that you enjoy it. All right, so that's going to be it for this video. I am going to talk about Oscar Wilde in the next one. Okay.